In this session, we'll introduce you to an early 19th century author who invented and pioneered a completely new literary form, historic fiction. The author is Sir Walter Scott, and by the end of this session you'll have a deeper understanding of why his works have left such an indelible mark on the history of Western literature, and why, even today, he continues to be an influence on writers of both fiction and poetry. We'll begin with the background of Sir Walter Scott himself, his life, his work, and the times in which he lived. Scott was both a poet and a novelist, and in both genres he was astonishingly prolific. At his peak in the early 1800s, he wrote 20 of his best novels in only 11 years. His first novel was entitled Waverly, and that book, and the 31 that followed, are referred to as the Waverly novels. That's because Scott wrote these novels anonymously, identifying himself only as the author of Waverly. He kept his identity secret because at that time novels were considered an inferior form of literature, and no one believed that a true artist or genius would write them. Scott did not remain anonymous for long, and his many and varied works soon established him as the most popular writer in what is known as the Romantic period, a period that began at the end of the 18th century, in about 1798, and lasted until 1825, a little over a quarter of a century. Through his remarkable books, Scott invented a form of literature completely unknown before that time, and still popular today, the historic romance, or the modern historical novel. Scott chose settings and characters from the long-ago past, and used them to weave stories and themes that had contemporary and timeless value. Although he preferred Scottish settings and characters, he also explored other countries and cultures. Scott's special ability was in creating exciting dramatic stories, placing them against the backdrop of some famous historic event, and enriching his story with detailed descriptions that vividly evoked the past. He is not a psychological writer and makes little attempt to explore and analyze the deeper motivation of his characters. He is also not considered a master of plot. Frequently, his plots are beset by contradictions, flaws, and inconsistencies. But he is a supreme storyteller. Sir Walter Scott was born on August 15, 1771, in Edinburgh, Scotland, at a time when his country was experiencing a golden age in the arts and sciences. His famous contemporaries include the philosopher David Hume, economist Adam Smith, and writers like Robert Burns and James Boswell. From childhood, Scott loved the ancient ballads and folk tales that glorified Scotland's past. He suffered a long illness as a child that left him partially lame, possibly polio, and while recovering at his grandfather's farm, he spent his time reading and listening to stories. This is where his passion for history and storytelling had its birth. Eventually, Scott went to Edinburgh to study law. He was admitted to the bar in 1792, and for a brief time led a traditional life. He had a well-paying job, married and fathered 4 children, and seemed to embody the middle-class values of his parents and social class. But the romance of the past had a stronger pull than the law, and he began traveling into the countryside, collecting ballads and tales about historic heroes and events. By the beginning of the next century, around 1802 or 1803, his writings about these travels had been published, and soon he would also write 7 long narrative poems, based on the ballads and legends he'd heard in the countryside. Scott decided to complete a discarded manuscript for a novel called Waverly. This novel, and the 31 that followed, launched a new career and brought him lasting fame as the creator of the historic romance. We're going to introduce you to the one novel which, for well over a century, has endeared him to readers the world over. The novel is Ivanhoe, a romantic adventure set in the times of King Richard's England, when noble heroes like Robin Hood fought for the right and the good, and corrupt tyrants like Prince John fought to overthrow the righteous. Ivanhoe contains all the classic story elements of the historic romance: duels and kidnappings, beautiful virtuous heroines and brave knights, castles and forests, and battles of both sword and ideals, all of which provide the setting in which good triumphs over evil once again. Ivanhoe is a brilliant example of the art form Scott invented and pioneered, the historic novel. The story of Ivanhoe opens in a forest in England at the time when King Richard has been absent for many years on the Crusades and was believed to be in captivity. During his absence, the country was under the oppressive rule of his brother John and Norman barons who believed themselves superior to the native Saxons. To begin with, we have the clear bias of the Normans against the Saxons and the Saxons against the Normans. Beyond this, we have the bigotry of both Normans and Saxons against the Jewish race, notably represented in this story by Rebecca and her father Isaac. Even our worthy protagonist Ivanhoe is subject to biases towards Rebecca and Isaac, as is the good King Richard. It is only Rebecca herself who seems free of any prejudice and willing to extend her goodwill to any individual of any race or creed. It is another contribution of Scott that he has been called the first writer to give Jewish characters prominence in the English novel. In Ivanhoe, he created Jewish characters who rose above his other characters, whose pacifism, compassion, and sense of honor was far more inspiring than the shallow virtues of their companions in the book, and who emerged as perhaps the only characters who were right, totally and unequivocally right. Therefore, when Rebecca and Isaac leave for Spain at the end of the book, it is an act that is most telling and which delivers a strong commentary on the moral condition of England at the time of the story. Scott clearly feels that England did not deserve Rebecca. Wearied by its cruel disdain for her race and sorrowed by the violence she has seen, Rebecca now seeks a happier, more suitable home, and England, in its ignorance, has lost a true heroine. Bigotry is perhaps the real antagonist in Ivanhoe, but another important theme that Scott explores is that of ideals versus practical reality. He manages to make a mockery of Cedric, the old Saxon who is rooted in the past and unable to adequately deal with the events of the present. He also demonstrates the sharp contrast between heroic chivalry and the acts of brutality and cruelty it invokes. Through Rebecca, he challenges men who vow loyalty to codes of liberty and right and then enforce them with blood and hate. The Crusades themselves offer the perfect example of this kind of misguided idealism. By the end of the novel, the reader is convinced that any fanaticism of thought, no matter how seemingly noble, must fail, because fanaticism itself allows no room for tolerance and compromise. Scott also explores the hypocrisy of religion and the church by presenting us with knights who belong to holy orders and yet who freely break their vows to pursue their own passions and greed. Although the conclusion of Ivanhoe is on the surface a happy ending, on deeper levels it is pessimistic. The king who returns to his throne will rule inadequately and with little success. His reign will be short. Hatred between Saxons and Normans will continue, and the departure of the gentle Rebecca is an ominous statement about the persistence of discrimination and the racial and religious hatred that is still unresolved. Although Scott is viewed as a romantic, his portrayal of the past is not an attempt to glorify it, but to use it to reflect the problems that still plague modern society. Sir Walter Scott invented a new form of literature, but through that literature he explored themes that are anything but new, which had relevance during the time in which he wrote, and which still have relevance today.